I used to believe I had everything figured out. A successful career, a beautiful wife, a thriving company. My life was a picture of stability. No surprises, no cracks in the foundation. At least, that's what I told myself. But life has a way of reminding you how fragile it all is, doesn't it? Sometimes it's a single moment, a fleeting look, or a tone in someone's voice that makes you pause and wonder, have I missed something? That's how it started for me. Small, almost imperceptible cracks that I ignored because the truth felt too heavy to face. It's strange to admit, but I think I felt it before I ever knew it. Lillian, my wife of 10 years, started pulling away. At first, it was subtle, excuses about late nights with friends, gym classes she suddenly couldn't miss, phone calls she'd end abruptly when I walked into the room. And then there was Daniel, my business partner, my so-called friend. He started pushing harder for risky projects, brushing off questions I'd normally expect him to answer. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just stress. Lillian's been restless before, and Daniel's always been ambitious. But deep down, I knew better. I've always trusted my instincts, and for weeks now, they've been screaming at me to pay attention. So, 3 weeks ago, I made a decision. I hired a private investigator. I didn't want to believe it, even as I waited for the first report to come in. I told myself I was being paranoid, that there was no way Lillian or Daniel could betray me. But last night, I learned the truth, and it hit me like a freight train. The email from Thomas Reed came late, after most of the office had emptied out. It was quiet, just the hum of the air conditioning and the steady patter of rain against the windows. I was sitting at my desk, reviewing financial reports, when the notification lit up my screen. The subject line read, "Preliminary Findings." I almost didn't open it. For a moment, I just stared at the screen, knowing that once I clicked, there'd be no going back. But curiosity, or maybe desperation, got the better of me. And so, I clicked. The photos came up one by one. The first showed Lillian stepping out of her black Range Rover, her hair perfectly styled, her smile radiant. She was standing in front of the Elysian Hotel, a place she'd never mentioned to me. The timestamp read 8:15 p.m., Monday. The next photo showed Daniel. He arrived 15 minutes later, his suit crisp, his posture confident. That's what killed me most, I think. How comfortable he looked, as if he belonged there. Then came the third photo. Lillian and Daniel at a private table on the hotel's rooftop. A bottle of wine sat between them, and her hand. Her hand was reaching across the table to touch his. She was smiling at him, a smile I hadn't seen in years. I don't remember how long I stared at that image. Minutes? Hours? Time stopped meaning anything. I couldn't feel anger or sadness, not at first. Just numbness. Betrayal isn't loud or obvious, you know? It's quiet, insidious. It creeps up on you until it's too late, and then you're left wondering how you missed it. The final photo sealed it. Lillian and Daniel leaving the hotel together. She was clinging to his arm, her head resting on his shoulder. They looked happy, and that's when it hit me. They weren't just having an affair. They were comfortable in their betrayal, confident that I'd never figure it out. When the numbness wore off, something else took its place. Not rage, not grief. Something colder. A sense of clarity I hadn't felt in years. Betrayal demands consequences, doesn't it? Not petty revenge or angry outbursts. No, real consequences take planning, precision, patience. I sat there for hours, piecing it all together. Every late-night phone call, every business expense Daniel insisted on pushing through, every moment Lillian had brushed me off. The pieces formed a picture so clear, I couldn't believe I hadn't seen it sooner. By the time I left the office, the rain had turned the streets into mirrors, reflecting the city's lights in fragmented patterns. I walked to my car with a single thought in my mind. They think they've won. Lillian and Daniel, sitting in their little bubble, convinced they're untouchable. But they don't know me as well as they think they do. I've spent my life building something out of nothing, outsmarting people who underestimated me. And now, I'm going to show them what happens when you betray a man who's always 10 steps ahead. For now, I'll let them believe they're safe. I'll let them think I'm blind to their lies. Because when I finally make my move, they won't see it coming. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, The images came rushing back. Lillian stepping out of her car. Her face lit up in a way I hadn't seen in years. Daniel meeting her at the hotel, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Her hand brushing his across the table. A small gesture filled with an intimacy I hadn't felt from her in longer than I wanted to admit. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rhythmic sound of her breathing beside me. She was asleep, her body curled under the blanket in that familiar way, the same way I'd seen every night for the last 10 years. But tonight, everything about her felt foreign. I tried to remember the last time I'd looked at her and felt connected. When had that spark died? Had I killed it with my long hours and endless focus on the company? Or had it faded because she'd already decided to give it to someone else? By the time the first light of dawn crept through the curtains, I couldn't stand it anymore. I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake her, and went downstairs. I made coffee in silence, staring out the kitchen window as the world outside slowly woke up. The house felt unbearably empty, even with her upstairs. I told myself it wasn't anger I felt, it was clarity. But the truth was, I wasn't sure what I felt. Betrayal? Hurt? Or just the crushing weight of realizing that the life I thought I had wasn't real. I got to the office early, hours before anyone else. I needed the solitude, the stillness, to figure out what I was going to do. Sitting at my desk, I opened the financial reports for Project Horizons, hoping to distract myself with numbers. Numbers are reliable. They don't lie, don't hide. But the more I looked, the more I saw things that didn't add up. Payments to a consulting firm I'd never heard of. Expenses that seemed inflated, buried in vague line items. I couldn't shake the thought that this wasn't just about Lillian and Daniel's affair. This was bigger. This was my company, my life's work, being manipulated, stolen from under me by the very man I trusted to build it with me. At some point, Martha Carter, our CFO, came into my office. She looked at me with that careful expression she always wears when she knows something's wrong but doesn't want to push. "Ewan," she said, "I've been reviewing the Horizons numbers. There's a consulting firm, Westwood Consulting Group, that's billed us quite a bit recently. I can't find much about them." I nodded, pretending I didn't already know what she was going to say. "Keep digging," I told her. "Let me know if you find anything unusual." Her brow furrowed slightly, but she didn't press. "Of course. I'll let you know." As she left, I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. The walls felt like they were closing in, but I couldn't let anyone see that. Not yet. I had to stay in control. I had to stay focused. Daniel came into my office later that morning, his usual confident self. He leaned casually against the doorframe, smiling like he didn't have a care in the world. "Ewan," he said, "have you had a chance to look over the Horizons updates? I think we're ready to move forward." I stared at him, wondering how he could lie to my face so easily, wondering if he even felt a shred of guilt. "Not yet," I said, keeping my voice steady. "There are some things I want to review first." His smile faltered for just a moment before he recovered. "Of course," he said. "Let me know if you need anything." As he left, I watched him go, my chest tightening. How long had he been doing this? How many meetings? How many late-night dinners? Had he walked out of my office thinking he'd gotten away with it? The thought made me sick. When I got home that evening, Lillian was in the kitchen, humming softly as she cooked. The smell of garlic and rosemary filled the air, a painfully familiar scent. She looked up when I walked in, her smile warm and effortless, like nothing had changed. "You're home early," she said, turning back to the stove. "That's a nice surprise." "Long day," I said, setting my bag down. "Thought I'd call it quits for once." She poured me a glass of wine and handed it to me. Her fingers brushed mine, and for a moment, I wondered if she felt the same emptiness I did. Did she even think about me anymore? Did she feel anything for me at all? "How was your day?" I asked, forcing the words out. "Oh, fine," she said lightly. "Kate and I were talking about planning a weekend away. Just the two of us. What do you think?" I nodded, taking a sip of wine. "Sounds nice," I said, though the thought of her lying to my face again made my stomach turn. We ate dinner together, just like we always did. She told me about her day, about Kate, about a charity event she wanted us to attend. I nodded along, pretending to listen, pretending to care. But all I could think about was how many nights like this she'd sat across from me, smiling and laughing, while her mind was somewhere else, with someone else. That night, as she slept beside me, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. My thoughts were a tangled mess of anger, hurt, and something else I couldn't quite name. Was it self-blame? Had I driven her to this? Had my long hours, my focus on the business, left her feeling abandoned? Or had she been looking for a way out all along? I reached for the notebook I kept in the nightstand, the one where I wrote down plans and ideas when I couldn't sleep. Flipping to a blank page, I started writing. When trust is broken, nothing is the same again. The words felt heavy, final. I closed the notebook and set it back on the table, staring at it for a moment before turning off the light. I didn't know what my next move was yet, but I knew one thing for sure. Lillian and Daniel thought they were playing me. They thought I'd never figure it out. They were wrong, because I wasn't the same man I'd been before I saw those photos. Something inside me had shifted, hardened. And when the time came, I wouldn't just set things right. I'd make sure they never forgot what they'd done. You know, it's strange how your world can feel both completely familiar and utterly alien at the same time. That morning, as I stood in the shower, letting the water run over me, everything felt heavy. The air, the sound of the water, even my own skin. I scrubbed at myself like I could wash away the weight of what I'd seen, but it clung to me like a second layer. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the image of her hand on his. I left the house before Lillian woke up. I couldn't bear the thought of her asking me if I wanted coffee or kissing me on the cheek before I left for work. Not after last night. Not when every word out of her mouth felt rehearsed, like lines from a play she'd been performing for months, maybe years. By the time I got to the office, the sun was just starting to rise, casting long, golden streaks across the city. I parked in the same spot I always did, rode the same elevator, walked the same hallways. But it all felt hollow, like I was watching myself from a distance, going through the motions of a life that didn't belong to me anymore. The office was empty, just the way I wanted it. I sat at my desk, staring at the financial reports I'd brought home the night before. The numbers stared back at me, cold and unyielding. I flipped through the pages, trying to focus, but my mind kept drifting. How did we get here? That was the question that wouldn't leave me alone. When did Lillian stop looking at me like I was her everything? Was it gradual, or did it happen all at once? Did I miss the signs, or did I just ignore them because it was easier? I thought about the way she smiled at me last night when I walked through the door. It was the same smile she used to give me when we first started dating. Warm, inviting, full of love. Except now I knew it wasn't for me. Not anymore. And that realization hit me like a punch to the chest. The knock at my door came around mid-morning. I barely looked up as Martha Carter, our CFO, stepped inside. Martha's one of the few people I trust completely. She's sharp, detail-oriented, and never afraid to speak her mind. "Ewan," she said, her voice soft but serious, "do you have a minute?" "Of course," I replied, gesturing for her to sit. "What's going on?" She handed me her tablet, her fingers lingering on it for a moment before letting go. "There's something I think you need to see. I've been reviewing the expenses for Horizons, and, well, something doesn't sit right." I glanced at the screen. It was an invoice from a company I didn't recognize, Westwood Consulting Group. The amount was significant, enough to raise eyebrows, but what caught my attention was the pattern. Several payments, all routed through different accounts, but ultimately landing in one place. "Do you know who's behind this?" I asked, my voice calmer than I felt. She hesitated. "Not officially, but I did some digging. The company was registered 6 months ago, and the account holder, it's Daniel." Her words hung in the air like a bad smell. I set the tablet down, my hands trembling ever so slightly. "Keep this between us," I said finally. "Don't tell anyone, not yet." Martha nodded, her expression unreadable. "Ewan, if this is what it looks like, we need to act fast. The board isn't going to wait." "I know," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you, Martha. I'll handle it." As she left, I stared at the closed door, my mind racing. Daniel wasn't just sleeping with my wife. He was stealing from me. From us. and he thought I wouldn't notice. The arrogance of it made my blood boil, but I forced myself to stay calm. Rage wouldn't help me now. Patience would. I avoided Daniel for the rest of the day, but he found me anyway. He walked into my office around noon, his usual grin plastered across his face. "Ewan," he said, leaning casually against the doorframe, "have you had a chance to look over the Horizons updates? The investors are eager to move forward." I looked at him, forcing my face into a mask of indifference. "Not yet," I said. "There are some details I want to review first." His grin faltered for a split second before returning. "Fair enough. Let me know if you need anything." As he left, I felt a wave of nausea roll over me. I'd known this man for nearly a decade. I'd trusted him, confided in him, built an empire with him, and now, every word out of his mouth felt like poison. That evening, I drove home in silence, the city lights blurring past me. When I pulled into the driveway, I sat there for a long time, staring at the house. The lights were on, and I could see Lillian moving in the kitchen, her silhouette framed by the window. It was such a familiar sight, one I'd seen 1,000 times. But tonight, it felt like I was looking at a stranger. When I finally walked inside, she greeted me with a smile and a kiss on the cheek. "You're home late," she said, handing me a glass of wine. "Long day?" "Yeah," I said, my voice flat. "Just trying to sort some things out." She nodded, turning back to the stove. "Dinner's almost ready. I thought we could eat outside. It's such a nice evening." We sat on the patio, the warm night air wrapping around us like a blanket. She talked about her day, about Kate, about some charity event she wanted us to attend. I nodded along, barely hearing her. All I could think about was how many times she'd done this. Sat across from me, smiling, laughing, pretending everything was fine. When she asked if I was okay, I forced a smile. "Just tired," I said. "Long day." Later that night, as she slept beside me, I opened my notebook and stared at the blank page. For a long time, I didn't write anything. I just sat there, listening to the sound of her breathing, feeling the weight of the truth pressing down on me. Finally, I picked up my pen and wrote, "The game isn't over until I say it is." I closed the notebook and set it aside, my jaw tightening. Lillian and Daniel thought they'd won. They thought I was blind, complacent, but they didn't know me. Not really. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. That morning felt heavier than most. The kind of heavy that settles in your chest, like you're breathing underwater. I didn't even glance at the mirror as I got ready. It was easier that way. I knew what I'd see. Dark circles under my eyes, tension etched into my jaw, and a man who didn't know where the last decade of his life had gone. Lillian was already up when I came downstairs. She was at the kitchen counter, scrolling through her phone with a steaming cup of coffee beside her. When she saw me, she smiled, as bright and effortless as ever. "Morning, love," she said, her voice chipper. "Coffee's fresh. Want me to make you some breakfast?" I shook my head, grabbing a mug and pouring my own coffee. I didn't trust my voice to respond just yet. The smell of the coffee, the familiar hum of the house, her casual presence, it all felt like a cruel joke. "You okay?" she asked, tilting her head. "You've been so quiet lately." I forced myself to meet her gaze, wondering how she could look at me so easily, so calmly, after everything. "I'm fine," I said. "Just a lot on my mind." She nodded sympathetically, reaching out to squeeze my arm. "Don't work too hard, okay?" Her hand lingered for a moment before she pulled away, heading to the sink to rinse her cup. I stood there, watching her, and wondered how much of this was real. Did she mean any of it? Or was she just playing her part, like she had for months, maybe years? The questions burned in my chest, but I swallowed them down. Not now. Not yet. The office felt like another planet that day. Every good morning, every casual chat, every email, it all felt distant, like I was watching someone else live my life. I sat at my desk, staring at the financial reports I'd been combing through for days. The numbers were clear now. Too clear. Daniel had been siphoning money for months. Westwood Consulting wasn't just a shady vendor. It was a shell company, tied directly to him. Payments routed through offshore accounts, hidden under layers of bureaucracy that no one was supposed to notice. But I'd noticed. And the more I uncovered, the angrier I became. How could he do this? Not just to the company, but to me? We built this place together. We started with nothing, worked late nights, celebrated every milestone. He wasn't just my business partner. He was my friend. At least, I thought he was. Martha Carter came into my office around mid-morning. She had a folder in her hand and a look on her face that said she knew something wasn't right. "Ewan," she said, sitting across from me, "I've been digging into the Westwood invoices. There's something you need to see." She opened the folder and handed me a printout. It was all there. Payments routed to offshore accounts, tied back to Daniel. My stomach tightened as I scanned the pages, each line item a dagger. "I didn't want to jump to conclusions," she continued, "but this doesn't look legitimate. And it's not just Horizons. He's been doing this across multiple projects." I nodded, my throat dry. "Thank you, Martha. Keep this between us for now." She hesitated, her eyes searching mine. "Ewan, if this gets out before you act, the board could lose trust in you. You need to get ahead of it." "I know," I said quietly. "I'll handle it." She didn't look convinced, but she nodded and left the room. I sat there, staring at the folder she'd left behind, my hands trembling slightly. The evidence was overwhelming. Daniel wasn't just betraying me. He was gutting the company from the inside out. And the worst part? He thought I'd never figure it out. Later that afternoon, Daniel walked into my office, his grin as confident as ever. "Ewan," he said, leaning against the doorframe, "I think we need to move forward on Horizons. The investors are getting impatient." I looked up at him, forcing myself to stay calm. "Not yet," I said. "There are still some things I want to review." His grin faltered, just for a second, before he shrugged. "All right, just let me know when you're ready." As he walked out, I felt the anger rising in my chest. He had no idea I knew. No idea how close he was to losing everything. When I got home, Lillian was in the living room, curled up on the couch with a glass of wine. She looked up when I walked in, her face lighting up like nothing had changed. "You're late," she said. "Long day?" "Yeah," I replied, setting my bag down. "Just trying to keep things from falling apart." She laughed lightly, not catching the weight of my words. "Don't work too hard. Kate's having a dinner party this weekend. She really wants us to come." I nodded absently. "Sure. Sounds great." She smiled and turned back to her wine, humming softly to herself. I stood there, watching her, wondering how long she could keep up this charade. Did she even care? Or was she so caught up in her own lies that she didn't see the cracks forming around her? That night, as Lillian slept beside me, I sat in my study, staring at the city lights through the window. Somewhere out there, Daniel and Lillian were probably laughing, drinking, living their lives as if nothing was wrong, as if I was blind to it all. I opened my notebook and flipped to a blank page. Slowly, deliberately, I wrote, "Some betrayals are unforgivable. Some choices leave no room for redemption." I stared at the words, letting them settle. Then I turned to the next page and started writing a plan. Every step, every move, every detail. I wasn't just going to confront them. I was going to dismantle them. They thought they'd won. They thought I'd stay quiet, keep playing my part, let them get away with it. They were wrong. Because this wasn't over. It was just beginning. There's a quiet kind of despair that creeps into you when the truth sinks in. Not the shock of discovery, but the weight of living with it. That was me on Thursday morning, standing in the shower, letting the hot water scald my skin. I wanted to feel clean, but no amount of scrubbing could wash away the guilt, the anger, the ache in my chest. I dried off mechanically, avoiding my reflection in the mirror. I didn't want to see the man staring back at me, the one who had let this happen. The one who'd been too trusting, too distracted, too blind to notice the cracks forming in his marriage and his business. Lillian was in the kitchen when I came downstairs, sipping her coffee and scrolling through her phone. She looked up when she heard my footsteps and smiled, her face lighting up in a way that felt cruel now. "Good morning," she said, her tone soft, effortless. "Coffee's fresh." I mumbled a thanks and poured myself a mug, my back to her. I couldn't face her yet. Not when I felt like I might shatter under the weight of everything unsaid. "You're awfully quiet this morning," she said, tilting her head. "Something on your mind?" I forced a smile, the kind you practice in front of a mirror. "Just work," I said, taking a sip of the coffee I could barely taste. She nodded, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Well, don't let it get to you. You've been working so hard lately." She stepped closer, placing a hand on my arm. "Take care of yourself, okay?" Her touch was light, familiar, but instead of comfort, it brought a sharp, twisting pain in my chest. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. She smiled again, kissed my cheek, and turned back to her phone. I stood there for a moment, gripping the counter, wondering how she could be so calm, so normal, after everything. Did she even feel guilty? Or was this all just another performance? At the office, the hum of activity felt distant, muted. I sat at my desk, staring at the latest report from Thomas Reed. It was all there, neatly laid out. The shell companies, the offshore accounts, the steady stream of money Daniel had funneled out of the company. But the numbers didn't hurt as much as the photos. Thomas had sent a few more, Daniel and Lillian, laughing together at some rooftop bar, their bodies leaning close, their smiles intimate. It wasn't just an affair. It was a relationship, a partnership, and somehow, that cut deeper than the lies, the stolen money, or even the betrayal itself. I closed the report and leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. My chest felt tight, my thoughts a tangled mess of anger and grief. I wasn't just losing my wife or my business partner. I was losing the version of my life I thought was real. By mid-morning, I called Catherine Hayes, my lawyer. I hadn't planned on doing it yet, but something inside me broke. I couldn't keep carrying this alone. "Catherine," I said when she answered, my voice heavier than I wanted it to be. "I need to see you. Today." There was a pause, then her familiar, steady voice. "Of course, Ewan. Come by at noon." I hung up, staring at my phone for a long moment. Saying it out loud, even just asking for her help, made it all feel more real. And I wasn't sure I was ready for that. Catherine's office was quiet, the way it always was. She greeted me with a firm handshake and a warm smile, but her eyes were sharp, assessing. "All right," she said, sitting across from me. "What's going on?" I took a deep breath, steadying myself. Then I told her everything. The photos, the financial discrepancies, the offshore accounts. The way Lillian had been slipping away from me for months, maybe years. The way Daniel had lied to my face, over and over again. She didn't interrupt, didn't ask questions. She just listened, her pen moving steadily across her notepad. When I finally finished, the silence between us felt like a weight pressing down on my chest. "Ewan," she said finally, her voice calm but firm, "this is serious. If you move forward with this, if you go after Daniel and file for divorce, it's going to get messy. Are you ready for that?" I nodded, though my hands were trembling. "I don't have a choice," I said quietly. "I can't let this go." Her expression softened, and she leaned forward slightly. "And Lillian, are you sure about ending things?" I swallowed hard, my throat tight. "She's not the person I thought she was," I said. "And maybe I'm not the person she thought I was either." Catherine nodded, her gaze steady. "All right, I'll start drafting the paperwork. And as for Daniel, we'll make sure you're protected. Legally, financially, everything." "Thank you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. When I got home that evening, the house felt unbearably quiet. Lillian was in the living room, curled up with a glass of wine and her tablet. She looked up when I walked in, her face lighting up like nothing had changed. "You're late," she said, setting her glass down. "Everything okay?" "Yeah," I lied, slipping off my shoes. "Just a long day." She smiled and patted the cushion beside her. "Come sit with me. I feel like I haven't seen you all week." I hesitated, the ache in my chest growing sharper. I wanted to sit. I wanted to wrap my arms around her and pretend, just for a little while, that everything was okay. But I couldn't. Not anymore. "I need to finish up some work," I said, avoiding her eyes. "Rain check?" She nodded, her smile dimming slightly. "Don't work too hard, okay?" I walked into my study and closed the door behind me, leaning against it for a moment as I let out a shaky breath. The mask I'd been wearing all day finally cracked, and the exhaustion hit me like a wave. That night, as she slept beside me, I opened my notebook again. The words I'd written the night before stared back at me. The moment before the fall is the most dangerous. It's when they think they've won. I stared at the page, my pen hovering over the paper. Finally, I wrote, "But the fall is inevitable, and when it comes, it will be devastating." I closed the notebook and set it aside, my jaw tightening. They thought they'd outsmarted me. They thought I was too blind, too weak to fight back. But they were wrong. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I thought I'd feel something more when the day came. Relief, satisfaction, even anger. But when I woke up that morning, all I felt was hollow. Like the person I used to be had evaporated, leaving behind a stranger in my own skin. Lillian was still asleep when I got out of bed. Her face was soft in the early morning light, the faintest hint of a smile on her lips. I stood there for a moment, staring at her, wondering how much of it had ever been real. The late-night talks, the lazy Sunday mornings, the quiet moments we used to share. Was it all a lie? Or had it just faded? I left the room quietly, shutting the door behind me. I didn't want to wake her. I didn't want to see her eyes, the ones that used to make me feel at home but now only reminded me of everything I'd lost. By the time I arrived at the office, the weight of the day was already crushing me. The board meeting was at 2 p.m., but I couldn't focus on anything else. I sat at my desk, staring at the presentation on my laptop. The slides were stark and clinical, numbers, dates, account records. They told the story of betrayal in black and white, but they couldn't capture the pain of it. I tried to distract myself with emails, with calls, with anything that might dull the ache. But nothing worked. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Daniel's smug smile, heard Lillian's laugh, felt the knife twist in my chest all over again. At 1:55 p.m., I walked into the conference room. The board members were already seated, chatting casually as they waited for the meeting to begin. Daniel was there too, laughing at some joke I didn't catch. When he saw me, he flashed that easy, confident grin. "Ewan," he said, leaning back in his chair, ready to make history? I didn't answer. I just sat down, opened my laptop, and waited for the room to quiet. When the meeting started, Daniel launched into his pitch for Horizons. He was as charismatic as ever, weaving tales of growth and opportunity, painting a picture so vivid you could almost see the money rolling in. He was good, better than I wanted to admit, but as I watched him, all I could think about was the years we'd spent building this company together. The late nights, the hard decisions, the celebrations when we hit milestones we never thought we'd reach. He wasn't just my business partner. He was my friend, my brother. And now, sitting across from me, all I could see was a man I didn't recognize. When he finished, the room was quiet. All eyes turned to me. I cleared my throat, my hands gripping the edge of the table. "Before we move forward," I began, "there's something I need to address." I clicked to the first slide. It was simple, a breakdown of payments tied to Westwood Consulting. "There are discrepancies in the financial records for Horizons," I said. "Funds have been diverted to an offshore account linked to a shell company." Daniel shifted in his seat, his smile faltering. "Ewan, if there's an issue, we can sort it out. There's no need to." "The sole beneficiary of that shell company," I continued, cutting him off, "is you, Daniel." The room erupted into murmurs. Daniel's face turned pale, his confident facade cracking. "This is a misunderstanding," he stammered. "Ewan, you know me. I would never." "Don't," I said, my voice trembling with restrained anger. "Don't lie to me. Not here. Not now." I clicked to the next slide, revealing the full trail, transactions, accounts, timestamps. The evidence was overwhelming. The board members leaned forward, their expressions shifting from confusion to disbelief to outrage. By the time the meeting ended, Daniel's fate was sealed. The board voted unanimously to terminate his partnership and launch a formal investigation. Security escorted him out of the building, his protests echoing down the hallway. I didn't watch him leave. I couldn't. It was too much. When I got home, Lillian was waiting for me in the living room. She was curled up on the couch with a glass of wine, her legs tucked under her. She looked up when I walked in, her face lighting up with a smile that used to make my heart race. "You're home early," she said. "Everything okay?" I stood there, staring at her, the words catching in my throat. For a moment, I thought about turning around and walking back out the door, but I couldn't. Not anymore. "We need to talk," I said finally, my voice quieter than I wanted it to be. Her smile faded. She set the wine glass down, her hands fidgeting in her lap. "What's wrong?" she asked. I sat down across from her, my hands resting on my knees. I took a deep breath, my chest tight. "I know," I said softly. Her eyes widened, panic flashing across her face. "You know what?" "I know about you and Daniel," I said, my voice cracking slightly. "I know about the lies, the dinners, everything." She stared at me, her lips trembling. "Ewan, I can explain." "Don't," I said, shaking my head. "Don't insult me by pretending there's an explanation for this." Tears filled her eyes, spilling over as she reached for me. "Please," she whispered. "Please, Ewan. I didn't mean for this to happen. I never wanted to hurt you." "You didn't just hurt me," I said, my voice breaking. "You destroyed us. You destroyed everything we built together." She sobbed, clutching at her knees, her tears falling freely. "We can fix this," she said desperately. "We can go to counseling. We can." "No," I said firmly. "It's too late." I pulled the envelope out of my bag and set it on the table. "These are divorce papers," I said. "I've already signed them." She stared at the envelope like it was a weapon, something meant to wound. "You don't mean this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Ewan, please, don't throw everything away." "I'm not the one who threw it away," I said, standing. "That was you." That night, as she cried herself to sleep in the guest room, I sat in my study, staring out at the city. The lights blurred as tears filled my own eyes. I didn't fight them. I let them fall, one by one, until the ache in my chest felt just a little lighter. I opened my notebook one last time and wrote, "Endings are painful, but sometimes they're the only way forward." I stared at the words for a long time before closing the notebook. Somewhere out there, Daniel was grappling with his downfall. Lillian was sitting with the wreckage of what she'd done. And me? I was still here, still breathing, still standing. It didn't feel like a victory. It felt like survival. And maybe that was enough. For the first time in months, I let myself think about the future. Not the life I'd lost, but the one I could still build. It wasn't hope, not yet, but it was the beginning of something real.